Move over, Omicron. December 1st is World AIDS Day. The UN estimates 79.3 million HIV/AIDS cases worldwide since the start of the epidemic, with 36.3 million deaths. And there's a real urgency now. In 2020, there were 37.7 million men, women, and children living with HIV. Since 1985, the National Institutes of Health has searched for a vaccine. In all that time, NIH has produced 0 vaccines to thwart HIV/AIDS. 0. But they've killed hundreds of thousands of monkeys in futility. My conversation with a former animal experimenter, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's show, it's World AIDS Day. We don't just recall the nearly 37 million who have died, but we look at the record of the scientists at the National Institutes of Health, who since 1985 have sought a vaccine, and in all this time have come up with nothing. Maybe it's because they've been using monkeys to find a cure in humans. The H in HIV stands for human. Researchers have solved what's known as monkey AIDS, but not human AIDS, but they keep doing the same thing over and over, spending billions of U.S. tax dollars and coming no closer to a cure. Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel is a former primate researcher and now a scientist with PETA. We talked about how NIH scientists have been entrenched in their failed approaches. In lieu of vaccines to prevent the disease, people with HIV/AIDS have had to depend on other drugs for treatment. It wouldn't be that way if the approach to vaccines began with humans, not monkeys. My conversation with Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel on the PETA Podcast. There's no vaccine, but there have been cocktails, these cocktails that have been used to check HIV. But what's the difference between a cocktail and an actual vaccine?
Well, so we have treatments. So we can for individuals who are infected with HIV, we can give them drugs that basically keep the infection under control, keep it in check, but it's still there.
Right. It's a treatment.
It's a treatment.
It's not a cure.
Exactly. It's not a cure.
But it's a treatment. And is a cocktail necessarily superior to a vaccine? Or they do different things? The vaccine keeps you from getting it.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I wouldn't even think they're two different paths towards health. Certainly with COVID, we've understood that the vaccine is a huge tool in public health in reducing the number of people who are going to get infected. The treatments that we have there's nothing special really about any COVID treatments out there right now. So we've got these monoclonal antibodies and a few others, but the best thing that we can do to maintain health and to keep the health system, our public health system up and working is to get people vaccinated. HIV, we haven't come up with that vaccine. The scientific community has not come up with that vaccine. And it's funny, that criticism has been getting some traction in the press recently, because the public's like, wait, you've got a COVID vaccine in a few months. You've had 35 years. Where's the HIV vaccine?
So once again, if you had a vaccine, you wouldn't have people getting HIV. But now that
Correct.
Without a vaccine, people get HIV, and the only treatment, fortunately, are these cocktail mixes of drugs that it doesn't cure HIV, but it enables people to live. Would it be better to have the vaccine in the first place to be that first line of defense?
Absolutely. That is public health. The vaccines that we give our children right after they're born, the vaccines that, our flu vaccines, our HPV vaccines, all the vaccines we give our companion animals. vaccines are really the first line of protecting public health. And without that, you're really scrambling. Then you have to treat all the sick people, or you have to develop the HIV cocktails, the AIDS cocktails. These are not, we're not talking about cranberry juice and vodka here. We're talking about some serious drugs that impact the body and that have consequences, for those individuals who are taking those drugs. So the fact that we still don't have a vaccine, yeah, that's a tough one. The fact that we have the National Primate Research Centers have spent $5 billion since the mid-'80s and have not been able to generate these vaccines, that's a problem, particularly when they said at the very beginning of this pandemic, hey, just give us money, just give us monkeys, and we'll give you a vaccine.
But Lisa, isn't it possible that the motivation to create a vaccine is minimized because the pharmaceutical companies make so much more money on the cocktails? Is that too cynical, or is that really kind of what could be happening?
I think that's a bit too cynical. And I think it also is not consistent with the way public health is conducted. So these cocktails are expensive. And HIV infections here in the US, the numbers have not been growing exponentially, but still in places like South Africa and parts of Asia, novel, new HIV infections are still at incredibly high rates. It is critical that we get those infections, that we develop a vaccine to stop those infections to stop the transmission before the individuals are actually infected. Once you have HIV, you are likely to pick up other infections like tuberculosis or valley fever or, cryptosporidium, or a whole host of other opportunistic infections that come along with your initial and kind of chronic infection with HIV.
Okay, maybe I was too cynical to say that the pharma companies would rather sell people the cocktail, but the fact is, if the HIV isn't growing as much in the U.S. as it is in other countries, and there is a way to deal with HIV here in the U.S. with these cocktails, and the pharma companies do provide that, could that be a demotivating thing that people, the corporations say, well, we're doing okay. We can keep letting NIH try to figure out if they can get a vaccine, but we've got this covered.
That's a complicated, there's a lot to unpack in that, Emil. So the amount of funding and the amount of research that the NPRCs, National Primate Research Centers, are receiving now for HIV research is actually declining a bit. And I think that is a reflection of it just hasn't worked. They haven't delivered on what they said they were going to deliver on. HIV itself, it's a really tough virus. That's the other thing. This is a really tricky virus. It mutates very efficiently. Are the pharma companies, are they willing? Yeah, they're making a lot of money off of these drugs. But I still think certainly we as the US, we have a responsibility to be leading the effective development of an HIV vaccine, not just for our own citizens, but for the global citizens.
So what I'm getting from you is that the cocktail drugs to treat HIV, that's a different thing from the virus, but it does seem like, or the vaccine rather, but it does seem like we've kind of dropped the ball if funding is being reduced, right? I mean, someone's getting the message that that it's not as urgent in the U.S.
Not as urgent. And I think that the amount of money, the overall NIH budget for HIV, that's still, it is a huge, it may be the biggest part. Actually, I have to go back and look at the numbers on this. The biggest part of the NIH budget may be towards HIV treatments and vaccines, but certainly within the primate research community, they haven't delivered, and they are starting to see that funding dry up. And actually just the researchers themselves are aging out. those old alpha males that were there and had been grinding through 10,000 monkeys during their career, those guys have just kind of been like, well, didn't work. And I don't see a lot of younger graduate students and postdocs following in the HIV kind of research track. There are forward-thinking researchers and scientists. They just aren't in the primate centers.
Right.
The primate centers are a bastion of really kind of old thought and very conservative thought. The thought that just relies upon a monkey, which is a lousy model for HIV/AIDS. Finding an HIV vaccine is high on NIH's priority list.
Yeah.
What doesn't seem to be as high as it used to be, for very good reason, is using monkeys to develop that vaccine, because that just has failed. It's failed at least 5 times.
Yeah.
5 times an HIV vaccine worked in monkeys, went out into the human clinical trials. 5 times it failed. That's 100% failure rate. That's pretty spectacular.
Yeah. And that really is like, it's every at bat. You're out.
Exactly.
You're out. I mean, there's no even like minimal kind of progress. Like, oh, we can build on that. It's all just
it's every at bat, and actually, and a couple of times the batter's been hit by the ball, meaning that some of those vaccines that worked in monkeys have actually increased the risk of humans actually getting infected with HIV. That's how bad. That's how misleading the monkey research was.
So let's go back to the beginning. HIV, AIDS. I mean, we're talking about this because World AIDS Day is on December 1st, and millions of people are going to be wearing the red ribbons. They're going to be reminded of what people can do. But you're saying there's something more people can do, and that is advocating for a vaccine research, but not at NIH, not through monkey research.
Advocating for HIV vaccine research, but not using monkeys,
Right.
Not at the NPRCs. The National Primate Research Centers were established back in the 1960s. They had pretty well, Congress put them in place. They chugged along for a couple of decades, but by the early 80s, they had really not fulfilled their promise. They were supposed to be bringing malaria vaccines and tuberculosis vaccines, and they weren't delivering. And there had been talk about actually pulling the plug on these NPRCs. But then HIV hit. And the primate centers said, wait, give us another chance. We'll get it right this time. We will give you this vaccine. So, I was looking at the numbers. So between 1981 and 2020, more than 1 million macaques came into this country. 1 million macaques were brought into this country from Asia, from Mauritius. The majority of those animals went into infectious disease research and primarily HIV research. By my calculation, about $5 billion, taxpayer dollars from NIH, have gone just to the National Primate Research Centers. The vast majority of that money was, and this is from 1985 to present, was for HIV research. These are really big numbers.
Yeah.
And yet we have a 100% failure on HIV vaccines with these monkeys. Folks, the writing, how much more clearly can this be laid out for people?
So why do we keep repeating the same thing? Like Einstein says, right, about insanity. So we keep doing this. And why were monkeys identified as the ideal medium in the first place to try to find an answer?
So here's the thing, again, so remember, back in the 60s, the NPRCs were established. And at that time, people were grabbing monkeys from all over the globe. Every single species of primate they could put their hand on, apes, African monkeys, Asian monkeys, New World monkeys, prosimians, were being scooped up and then brought over to the US and dropped, divvied up between these. At that time, there were 8 primate centers. And during that time, and this is actually, so in retrospect, this is how we understand this. And this is all published in papers, actually from the NPRCs. So what was going on? They were mixing species that normally wouldn't come together. So an African species of primate with an Asian species in the next cage, or actually at the California Primate Center, they fed Asian rhesus macaques. They were doing kuru studies. So this was the studies that looking at whether or not the brain degenerative, the kuru work. They took sooty mangabe brains and fed them to rhesus macaques. When they did that, they actually, unintentionally, they exposed those Asian macaques, rhesus macaques, to SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. So HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, SIV, simian or monkey immunodeficiency virus. So it turned out that, most African primates have an SIV, the simian immunodeficiency virus. It's been around with them for millions of years, doesn't really cause much problems for them at all when it stays within its own species. But when you take and that virus jumps from one species to another, from like these African sooty mangabes to these Asian macaques, that's when things go south. So in the 1960s, again, they had these species together. So not only were they in close contact, but they actually were doing experimental manipulations that directly exposed, unintentionally, Asian macaques. In the 70s, the California Primate Center, still not knowing that they had done this, they started transporting some of their monkeys to the New England Primate Center. And when they did that, by taking monkeys from their centers, sending them across country, which, by the way, they're still doing today, they actually took these infected monkeys and sent them across the states. They landed in New England. In the 1980s, a laboratory in upstate New York called Lemsiv actually took some of its monkeys, which had been unintentionally infected with SIV, sent those to the New England Primate Center. So the NPRCs they've basically, by sending these monkeys, transporting these monkeys between their facilities in the 60s or the 70s and 80s, they seeded all of their primate centers with sick monkeys. Then they actually said, hey, all these, this was actually in California, the Primate Center, 1984. They started seeing a bunch of monkeys in a crowd getting really sick. They were like, gosh, we haven't seen these kinds of illness. They had a diarrheal disease. They had weight loss. They were getting these unusual infections. They had enlarged livers, enlarged lymph nodes. And the experimenters there said, wow, this looks a lot like AIDS, this acquired immune deficiency syndrome that we're seeing in humans. Yay, we just found the monkey model for AIDS. Aren't we clever?
And they were wrong.
Well, they did find they found monkeys with AIDS-like simian or symptoms. They actually called it SAIDS, simian acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. But yes, they were absolutely wrong, because monkey SAIDS we've cured monkey SAIDS a few times. We've cured monkey, SIV a few times, but monkey SIV is not human HIV.
So here are the scientists who we're supposed to trust. They're the smart guys. They have this monkey AIDS, SIV, and SAIDS, and they have found a cure for that. And then they took a leap saying that, maybe this will help us conquer human AIDS.
Exactly. So and this has been repeated again and again and again. It's kind of making lemonade out of lemons. They find these through poor husbandry, through a lack of understanding basic what these monkeys were naturally infected with. They made sick monkeys. They made monkeys infected with SIV that were not naturally infected. And their response was, great, look what these little monsters are that we made. Now we're going to use that, and we'll use these animals, and we will use this to model what this looks like in humans. But that's actually, it hasn't worked that way.
So, but that was their feeling of, here's our progress. We've discovered this SIV, and now we have the basis in which to go after HIV.
Exactly.
And it never...
It just hasn't panned out.
Well, you say that even in the acronym SIV simian, right?
Deficiency virus.
Yeah. And then HIV is human. So in the name, that should be the clue. Human specific. We can't, why one does not translate to the other. But why are these scientists so willing to try to test that? Because it seems like, well, we know it's obvious they know this is monkey, this is human, but maybe we'll get the answer. Is that the hypothesis, that they're going to get a breakthrough?
I think that's what they're thinking. I was in the biomedical community while this was going on, and the belief was, this is what'll get us there, even though from the very beginning, there have been scientists within the primate biomedical community who said, it's not quite as straightforward. It's not quite as clean as we're making it seem. It's not the path between SIV and HIV is not a straight line, folks. Yet, again, we're talking about so much money, Emil. And we're also talking about a virus that terrified the globe. So people were willing to do whatever.
Even though it was scientifically illogical. I mean, it would have had to been a tremendous breakthrough to I mean, it would have been a breakthrough to say, oh, it worked in, we found this thing in monkeys and it translates to humans. That would have been Nobel winning, right?
Right. But that didn't happen. And here we are, nearly 40 years on. 40 years doing the exact same thing. Sometimes the community does it with a rhesus macaque, and sometimes with a pig-tailed macaque, and sometimes with a mangabe, and sometimes with a chimpanzee and a long-tailed macaque, and sometimes with SIV mac, or sometimes with SHIV, this chimeric hybrid human monkey virus. But 40 years, 40 freaking years, and you still haven't gotten it right. You need to look at the fundamental problem. And those problems are so clear. And they know about them within the primate community. And still, it's as if there are blinders on and they're just going forward and just grinding through these monkeys and grinding through these taxpayer dollars.
Well, they get they're getting the funding, except now you're saying that people the funding is drying up a bit.
Because they haven't delivered. And I think that the rest of the scientific community has said, they're looking at the animal experimenters and they're saying, well, God, you guys have gotten so much money and you haven't delivered on your promised vaccines. How about you take some of that money that's been going to this dead-end animal studies, this 20th century science, and redirect it to 21st century science, redirect it to these alternatives that we know are much more likely to reflect, because these are using human tissues. These are using human stem cells. These are using, organs on a chip that are developed from human tissues, not some ridiculous monkey cells where the virus adapts to the monkey's cells and so then you're getting a completely different response. Come on, scientific community, you know better than this by now.
They want to keep hypothesizing. I guess.
I don't think it's a hypothesis anymore. I think they just want to keep riding this monkey train.
Yeah. Well, tell me you said 1 million monkeys have been brought over.
Yeah.
And how many billions of dollars has been spent?
At least 5 billion. And again, this is just within the NPRCs.
Yeah.
And it's from 85.
And of course, the leader in this, because I remember when I covered AIDS in San Francisco in the 80s, Dr. Anthony Fauci was the head of trying to find a vaccine. Do you think he's done a little better on the COVID situation, but that's separate. That's another issue. But on this issue alone, and the management of monies and experiments, toward getting some kind of relief for, American society and humankind, what kind of grade would you give Dr. Anthony Fauci?
I think Dr. Fauci is a good scientist, but when it comes to the monkey research, and again, you're right, he was using monkeys early on. Some of the very earliest papers on HIV work, SIV work, have Fauci's name on it. What I think he has failed to do is to recognize the failure of the primate model, and to acknowledge that, or to even question it. He hasn't questioned it. I mean, he's made some oblique references, like that's the vaccine that came out in 2018 that failed. I think, Fauci even said at that point, well, maybe the good results in the monkeys were a fluke. No, the problem is that the way that we house, the way that we source, the way that we characterize monkeys for research makes them utterly unreliable and inappropriate as biomedical models. Fauci just published a paper last year using monkeys that came from valley fever endemic areas. So I'm sorry, I got to pivot back to valley fever because I think this is one of the things here. So recently, we had that big expose about the Washington Primate Center and their breeding facility in Mesa, Arizona, where the monkeys are infected with valley fever. And the WAMPRC scientists have said, you know what? Monkeys who have been exposed and infected with valley fever should not be used on HIV studies because either the current or the previous infection with valley fever renders them basically useless on HIV studies. Valley fever happens to be endemic throughout the Southwest, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico. Texas has the largest breeding colonies for macaques in the country. Texas is it's the epicenter for valley fever. We should absolutely assume that every one of those macaques that has been hanging out in Texas, in Alice, Texas, or in the primate centers throughout Texas, have been exposed and infected with valley fever, and they should not be used on HIV studies. This recent paper that Fauci was on, some of those monkeys came from Texas.
Yeah. So it would be a waste of time and effort and money, but also is there a threat of these? Well, in the case of valley fever, there would be a threat to humans, no?
Not with valley fever, because valley fever is a fungus in the soil. Okay. So the monkeys are not, the monkeys actually, as these primate centers and as these big contract breeding facilities are moving monkeys across the country, yeah, I mean, actually, the fungus, the fungi could be on the fur of the monkeys or in the crates that are being shipped around. So potentially those spores could be transmitted into other places. But valley fever is not a zoonotic disease. But valley fever is just one of the ones that we have to worry about in these big facilities. There are lots of other infectious agents that these monkeys carry with them that are absolutely a risk to human health.
Like, for example, one good one.
Let's talk about tuberculosis.
Oh, that's a good one. People know about that.
Exactly. People know about tuberculosis. But you know what people don't know is that when it comes to the monkey community, the monkey biomedical community, we have been using, I was using it too, the same test to detect TB in those monkeys for the last 50 years, a test that the community absolutely will say this test it's a lousy test. It's called the TST, tuberculin skin test. Everyone will agree it's not good at detecting latent infections. It'll give you false positives. It'll give you false negatives. It's a really crummy test. And yet, that is the test that the primate community continues to use. The part that people really don't understand, and we're going to make sure, PETA's going to make sure they know about this soon, is that the monkeys who are on these HIV studies, actually, we don't even test them for tuberculosis because you can't, because this TST test requires that the animal has an intact immune system. And if you're on an HIV or an SIV study and you're a monkey, you're not going to have an intact immune system. So from the human studies, we already know that if you're a human and you're infected with HIV, you are much more likely to get infected with tuberculosis. That's one of those kind of opportunistic infections that will come along. So here we go. We have monkeys, tens of thousands of monkeys in this country. We don't have a good way to detect whether or not they're infected with tuberculosis. We're sending these monkeys hither, dither, whither, nither, and yon around this country. They're gone from facility to facility to facility. Then we're putting them on HIV studies, and we have no way of knowing. The biomedical community has no way of knowing whether or not those animals have TB or whether they've had latent TB that gets reactivated once they're on that HIV study. So it's the exact same story we had with valley fever. If you don't know what's in your monkey model and you experimentally infect that animal with your experimental infection, you are not going to know whether or not your vaccine or your treatment is acting on your experimental infection or this unintended infection that's in the animal.
So bad monkeys, bad science, and money down the drain, and no HIV vaccine.
Exactly.
So, and we're still doing it. That's the point.
We're still doing it, but not for much longer. I truly believe that we are on the cusp. It's more and more this information is getting out. The PETA membership they're reaching out to the legislators, they're reaching out to NIH. We're letting people know that, hey, not only do these animals suffer so horrifically when they're in the laboratories, but the science is so utterly and irrevocably confounded that stop killing the monkeys, stop wasting the dollars, take this money, put it towards research that is cutting edge research, that is human relevant, that is human centric research. None of this ridiculous mismanaged monkey mess.
What are the chances of getting a real vaccine or a real result if we did that? If we did what you just said, go to human relevant research? What better chance do we have of getting to what we have always defined as the goal for the last 40 years, which is a vaccine?
The American scientific community is brilliant. That we are globally, we have one of the strongest scientific communities out there. And so if we stop wasting billions of dollars on this dead end animal research and redirect those fundings to the scientists who are doing cutting edge research, I think we stand a really good chance of seeing huge strides made in developing these HIV vaccines. Cut the monkey out of this. Focus on using human tissues, human cells. Focus on the human biology, the human immunology, not some confounded, twisted, contorted monkey that you've basically tied these monkeys up in knots and infect them with these chimeric viruses to try to mimic something that is simply, it's not working. This is a human virus. We need to focus on human relevant techniques.
And World AIDS Day, December 1st, 2021 would be a good time to start.
Absolutely. The humans deserve it. The monkeys deserve it. They have paid a horrific cost in this. And the HIV community deserves better than this. They deserve real research, real relevant research, not this money thrown at these monkeys.
Primate scientist Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel is a Fulbright scholar, former scientist, and professor at the University of Washington. She's now a PETA scientist. For more on World AIDS Day, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Hope today's show gives you pause to reflect on the tens of millions of lives lost. I know I lived in San Francisco in the 80s, and just thinking about all that happened, and thinking of all the monkeys who've died in futility as well. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMIL-AMOK. Or see my vlog at amok.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app and on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.